Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 607th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work together to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Water is one of the things we need multiple times a day. And as it gets hotter and drier, we need to become a lot more aware of where our water comes from and where it goes. Plus, when we're growing food, we're going to need to think about where we're getting our water from. People are surprised when they learn that I collect rainwater for my garden, even though I live in the desert of Phoenix, Arizona. What most people don't know is that you can harvest a lot of water. For example, it only takes 1 inch of rain on a 1,000 square foot collection area, such as the roof of your house, to collect 600 gallons of water. That's why you don't need to live in a wet place for water harvesting to be a viable self-sufficiency tool for your house and garden. If I can do it in Phoenix, then you can do it no matter where you are, especially if you live in a wetter place than where I do. Learning to harvest your own fresh water means you don't have to rely heavily on your area's municipal water supply. You can be in control of the inputs into your garden and stop watering your plants with chemically treated water. If you're ready to up-level your garden game and explore all the possibilities of harvesting water, you'll want to attend the Urban Farm U's upcoming online water harvesting summit this June 15th through the 17th. This 3-day event features visionary speakers sharing their expert knowledge on topics like rainwater harvesting, graywater harvesting, subsurface irrigation, building healthy soil to hold more water, and more. The 2021 Water Harvesting Summit is free to attend, and you're going to learn the best techniques for watering your garden and saving water. And I have a little surprise in store for you when you sign up. To reserve your spot in the summit, head over to waterharvestingsummit.com and get ready to create the self-sufficient life of your dreams. Today is Farmer Friday, a quick tidbit for growing your garden. Each episode will feature less than 10 minutes of essential content for growing your garden, and some episodes we will answer your questions. If you have one, send it to questions@urbanfarm.org. Today, we're talking with Kristina Hunter with the Live Well Green podcast about soil contaminants to watch for on your urban farm or garden. Enjoy. Welcome, Kristina.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. When you proposed this topic, it was like soil contaminants for our garden. What's that about?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful thing to be engaged in gardening and to be growing your own food and doing activities in the soil in general is really good for us. But the reality is that there is the potential to have contaminants in our soil, and that might be even elevated when we're talking about the urban environment. So that's why I thought it might be something good to pay attention to, just so that we have it on our radar and we can minimize any potential risks.
One of the things that I was made aware of, I've lived in my house for 32 years, and when they originally painted the house, there was likely lead. And so, as the weather happens, that lead might slough off into the soil, maybe?
Exactly. And that's really one of the main contaminants of concern that we're talking about here. When it comes to the urban environment, we have a variety of things that we should be paying attention to, and lead is one of them. And then other ones include things that we lump into the category of heavy metals. And these heavy metals are things that interfere with our nervous system. And it's especially important for developing nervous systems. So that becomes really, really relevant for young children as well as the developing fetus. So pregnant, mothers need to pay a special attention to that. So the heavy metals are a concern, like lead. And then there's also arsenic, which is a carcinogen. It causes cancer. And it can be found naturally in some soils, but not a whole lot in this area of the world. But it is possible. And then we also have the concern with hydrocarbons. And that's not such a surprise because we know we use a lot of hydrocarbons in our gas powered vehicles and diesel powered trucks and so on. And that deposition is coming to us in a variety of ways. So it might have been, spilled on the site historically or released in some industrial process. And then we have those emissions coming from the busy highways and roads. And those can release small particles, and those small particles drift through the air and eventually land on the soil and your yard and your house and so on. And we know that because when we have our windows open in the summer or warm months, we have all kinds of dust that accumulates, right, on a
Mm-hmm.
surface in our home. And well, that comes from somewhere. And those particles can just be regular dust, but it can also have contamination attached to it. And so if we have a source nearby that's releasing that type of contaminant, then it can be also deposited on our garden and in the soil that we're trying to grow our food on.
So then hydrocarbons also are in the air from exhaust from vehicles, right? So
Yes.
I guess when it rains and, when there's dust, that's when we're interacting with that.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So it's interesting because we often think of hydrocarbons as being the type that we smell, right? When we gas up our car, if you have a
Mm-hmm.
gas powered vehicle, you can smell it. And that's volatile, it's a gas. And certainly that can, come out in rainfall and so on, but the particles are also emitted. And that's especially from diesel burning vehicles. And they
Ah.
emit small particles. And these particles we're beginning to know more and more about the harmful effects of those, and that's particularly to our respiratory system, although they might also have a role in cancer. So there's some interesting concerns associated with those small particulates that when we breathe them in, they can be a problem. And then they can be carrying other things that are called PAHs, those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And that's another whole suite of compounds. And some of those are also carcinogenic and
Wow.
harmful to developing fetuses and so on. So, this is a variety of contaminants that we need to pay attention to.
And so what do we do about all of this?
Yeah. So, well, it's interesting. So when we think about where these things are coming from, we know that we could have some historical contamination. So first, let's understand how it could be getting onto our soils and thereby be a concern for our gardening and permaculture activities. So, first of all, getting to understand the site's history a little bit is really important for us. And we might know about an old industrial plant nearby or an old landfill, and that type of thing might be a concern if you have that situation. Or even historical activities on agricultural land could lead to soil contamination. In the US, for example, a variety of pesticides were composed of something called lead arsenate between 1910 and 1950 or so. And that
Wow.
was used widely in agriculture. So we might think of agricultural land historically as being pristine, but that's not necessarily the case. And then we can also just have overuse of today's modern pesticides and herbicides by previous homeowners, because that's an activity that's relatively poorly regulated and people don't always know. They think a little is good, more might be better. So there is the potential from historical contamination. And then there's the ongoing sense of contamination from roads nearby or industry nearby. Or we might even have concerns with some of the things that might be in our garden, like pressure treated lumber. Now, you might have already dealt with this on your show, but up until about 2003 to 2006, this green pressure treated wood that was on the market had a compound called chromated copper arsenate,
Yep.
or CCA, and that contains arsenic, which is a known human carcinogen, and it does leach out of that pressure treated wood, that older green pressure treated. Now, I say 2003 to '06 because it's depending on where you were in the world, but it was roughly till 2004 in the US that it stopped being able to be used for most applications in the US market, aside from things that were associated with your foundation, where it can still be used in a residential setting. But this is something that we definitely don't want to have as a garden bed or anything in contact with soil because that compound can leach out of the pressure treated wood.
So we don't want to use pressure treated wood at all really, do we?
We don't
Yeah.
really. Now, there there's a better option if you feel you do need to, and that's the darker brown pressure treated. And that one is pressure treated with a different type of process where they actually inject particles into the lumber itself, and so it's much less likely to be leached out. And so that's
Mm,
called MCA. So you'll see that there's a little label on the wood itself that says MCA on it. And so that's the dark brown pressure treated, which would be the safest of all the options. But we still are recommended not to burn that wood or the
right.
sawdust or to allow it to come in direct contact with food itself. So
Just avoid
now,
it.
yeah,
Just
exactly.
avoid it. Just avoid pressure treated wood.
Yeah. Now, the good news is there has been research done on a variety of contaminants in soil to see if it does potentially migrate into the food that we're growing. And yes, it can, but the good news is it's just at low levels, which is super. But maybe to be expected, the highest levels tend to be in root vegetables, which makes a lot of sense because those root vegetables tend to be in contact with the soil for the longest period of time.
Hmm.
So it's not a problem. We should still be paying attention and growing our vegetables and all that because we have lots of benefits from it. But if you do have concerns, you can always take your soil into a lab to get tested. And if that doesn't work for you, or if you don't know what to ask for, you can always approach your local university. Their soils department will be happy to help out. And if you have some complex situation where maybe it was an industrial site or you suspect contamination nearby, there might have been a study on the soils in your area already, and your local university will be able to help you out with that.
All right.
Yeah, but we should definitely avoid all that old pressure treated wood, as well as any creosote treated old railway ties. Those are not safe either. But definitely, all of the vegetables were shown to have only low levels. And so, if we are concerned still, we can just use a raised bed for gardening and we can bring in new soil. And the really good news is that it's been shown that adding compost also reduces levels of contaminant by
Yay.
just diluting
Right.
the contaminant, right? So
Yeah.
we know compost is so great for gardens and for permaculture. So it's also great for reducing levels of contaminants. And then finally, when you do eat your veggies, you want to wash off any visible dirt. And you don't need to worry about too much soap or anything like that, but just taking off the visible dirt if you have a concern for contaminants. But regular old dirt, that's still good for you.
Right. It's kind of our bi it's kind of in our biome that those
It is.
yeah. So a couple of things. So if we were going to test for something, you might want to check with a local lab and see if there are any issues in your area that they may know of. But
Great point.
lead and arsenic are two things that could be tested for, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing that some people don't really realize that you need to know what you're testing for before you send a soil sample to the lab.
Exactly.
And that's a bit tricky sometimes to
Yeah.
know what to ask for. So that's why your university might help you out and you really want to come to it from an informed perspective. So if you have a little bit of background in it and you understand that there was a battery crushing facility nearby, well then we can have an insight into that activity and what potential contaminants would be associated with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, have you ever heard that kale is a heavy metal bioaccumulator?
Yeah, one study I saw, they did look at kale and it did not accumulate arsenic or lead at any higher level,
Mm,
although it might be the case for some other contaminants, but that was just the one from Kansas State University that I looked at.
yeah, got it. And then the other thing is, and I cringed in the past when people do garden consults with me,
Hmm.
and they had just purchased a property that got built on an old piece of agricultural land.
Hmm.
If you are in the arena of looking to buy a home, do your homework to make sure that you're not actually buying on recently retired agricultural land because there's quite a bit of chemicals that are used on those, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and what's unfortunate is, in addition to that, our modern agricultural practices really decimate the soil organic matter.
Yeah.
So we have double hit there that we might have an accumulation of pesticides and herbicides, and then we also have a reduction in soil organic matter, and as well as small particle size and kind of small granularity, which isn't great for yeah,
Yeah.
pore space and root infiltration. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing about this, Christina. Tell us about your podcast and where we can find it, please.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, I just wanted to, first of all, say don't be afraid of the produce that you are getting out of your garden. It is
Yes.
wonderful and healthy and great for your body, but just having an informed perspective on the potential risks is a good idea. So I am podcasting as well, and but I'm just a baby in this world. But the podcast is called Live Well Green with Kristina Hunter, and it can be found wherever you get your podcasts. And it can also be through my website, which is ChristinaHunterFlourishing.com. That's Christina with a K.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I have to say, I was recently your guest on your podcast. And one of the things that I noticed about you is I love the way you think. You have a really good critical thinking going on. And it was great fun being on your podcast. So go listen to Christina.
I loved it as well. Thanks, Craig.
You bet. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.